I want you out of my house right now. Get your things and get out. I never want to see you again.
Walter Henriksen stood outside Brookfield Senior Living on a Tuesday morning in April, two suitcases beside him, watching his son's car pull out of the drop-off lane before Walter had even finished thanking the orderly for carrying his bags inside. Walter was 84. He'd built a furniture company from a single rented workshop into a regional manufacturer, and he was being left at a facility he hadn't chosen for reasons no one had fully explained. Exactly 3 weeks later, that same son's company would file for emergency bankruptcy protection, and the reason traced back, almost precisely, to that curb. Walter founded Henriksen Furniture in 1962, growing it over 45 years into a manufacturer generating $60 million in annual revenue before selling a majority stake in 2015 for $22 million, retaining a 12% minority interest and full ownership of the family estate, a $4.1 million property he and his late wife Margaret had lived in since 1978. Margaret died 8 months earlier from congestive heart failure after 51 years of marriage. Walter's family noticed changes afterward: missed appointments, repeated stories, occasional confusion about dates, and assumed, without further evaluation, that this represented the beginning of irreversible cognitive decline rather than what it actually was: profound grief, compounding an undiagnosed sleep disorder no one had thought to investigate. Mark Henriksen, 52, ran Henriksen Custom Interiors, the smaller subsidiary his father had carved out for him during the 2015 sale. What Mark hadn't disclosed to anyone, including his wife Denise, was that a factory retrofit project had run $2.1 million over budget across the preceding 18 months, leaving him personally guaranteeing debt he had no realistic path to repay through the subsidiary's operating revenue alone. Mark and Denise approached Walter about downsizing 3 weeks after Margaret's funeral, framing the nursing home placement as protective, citing his grief-related confusion as evidence he shouldn't be managing the estate alone. Walter, exhausted and still barely sleeping most nights, agreed faster than he might have a year earlier, telling Sophie, his 24-year-old granddaughter, only that he didn't have the fight left to argue about it. During the same visit, Mark presented Walter with a broad, durable power of attorney, described verbally as necessary to help manage bills while you get settled. Walter signed it at his kitchen table, still wearing the same clothes he'd slept in, 4 days after a stretch of what his eventual sleep specialist would later document as fewer than 10 hours of consolidated sleep across 5 nights. A state, she'd testify, that significantly impairs informed decision-making regardless of underlying cognitive health. Walter received no visitors for the first 12 days at Brookfield. Staff nurse Patricia Nakamelu noticed the pattern early. Newly admitted residents following a spouse's death, isolated from family within weeks, was a configuration she'd seen before, and one the facility's training specifically flagged as a risk indicator for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Sophie visited unannounced on day 13, a graduate student in urban planning who'd been buried in coursework, but couldn't shake a nagging discomfort about how quickly the family had moved her grandfather out. Walter mentioned, almost in passing, that he hadn't seen his most recent bank statement and wasn't sure why his card had declined at the facility's small gift shop that morning. Patricia, listening from the doorway, had independently begun logging concerns in Walter's chart: unexplained financial confusion, no family contact, a rushed power of attorney signed within weeks of a spousal death. She contacted the state's Adult Protective Services Division that same afternoon, a call she later said she'd been building the professional courage to make since Walter's admission. A PS opened a formal investigation, bringing in a forensic accountant who reviewed account activity across the 3 weeks since Walter's POA was signed. The findings were stark. $340,000 transferred from Walter's personal accounts into Henriksen Custom Interiors' operating account, structured across 4 transactions specifically sized to remain below the bank's automatic large transfer review threshold. Simultaneously, and unrelated to the APS investigation at its outset, Mark had pledged the family estate, still legally in Walter's name, now accessible through the POA, as collateral for a $3.4 million emergency loan intended to cover the factory retrofit overrun, with closing scheduled for the same week APS opened its file. A PS's investigation triggered an automatic title complication once formally logged with the county recorder's office, flagging the estate as subject to a pending financial exploitation review. The lender, Meridian Commercial Bank, discovered the flag during final underwriting and withdrew from the loan 4 days before scheduled closing, citing an inability to secure clear collateral. Mark's failed refinancing triggered cross-default provisions on 2 prior credit facilities tied to the subsidiary, both of which included clauses accelerating full repayment upon any related default. Within 5 business days, Henriksen Custom Interiors owed $5.8 million in immediately due obligations against $310,000 in available liquidity. The subsidiary filed for emergency bankruptcy protection exactly 3 weeks after Walter's admission to Brookfield, laying off 180 employees within the month. Mark and Denise's personal assets, cross-collateralized against the same failed loan structure, faced separate creditor claims, including a lien filed against their own home. Walter learned about both the APS investigation and his son's bankruptcy within the same 48-hour window, from a caseworker rather than his own family. Her trembling voice, he'd later tell Sophie, wasn't what he remembered most. It was the specific moment he realized the missing bank statement he'd mentioned so casually wasn't confusion at all. At Sophie's insistence, Walter underwent a full cognitive evaluation alongside a sleep study, ordered independently of the APS case. The results showed no evidence of dementia or lasting cognitive impairment. Instead, a diagnosis of severe obstructive sleep apnea, likely present for years, but masked by Margaret's own sleep patterns, now unmasked and worsened by grief-related insomnia following her death. The state filed charges against Mark for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, a felony in the jurisdiction given the documented transfer amount and timing relative to Margaret's death and Walter's compromised sleep-deprived state at signing. Denise, after a forensic review found no direct evidence of her involvement in structuring the transfers, avoided charges but filed for legal separation 4 months later. With guardianship complications resolved and his POA formally revoked by court order, Walter left Brookfield 9 weeks after arriving, returning home with a part-time home health aide rather than full-time facility care. A level of support his restored cognitive evaluation confirmed was more than sufficient for his actual needs. Walter restructured his estate plan with an independent trustee and elder law attorney, establishing an irrevocable trust for his grandchildren's education, explicitly removing Mark from any direct financial control while preserving a modest, structured allowance intended to support, not enable, his son's eventual recovery, contingent on completed financial counseling. Walter committed $1.2 million to establish the Margaret Henriksen Elder Protection Fund, partnering directly with the state APS office to fund expanded caseworker training on recognizing financial exploitation following spousal loss, training modeled explicitly on the pattern Patricia had identified almost entirely on instinct and experience, formalizing it into protocol for the first time in the agency's 22-year history. Sophie deferred her urban planning program's final year to work as a research assistant supporting the fund's first training cohort, later applying to law school with a stated focus on elder law and guardianship reform, a path she credited directly to watching how close her grandfather came to losing both his independence and his fortune, to a process almost no one outside Patricia had been trained to notice in time. Walter and Mark speak occasionally, mostly through Sophie as an intermediary, a relationship neither man describes as repaired so much as still standing, unresolved, in the particular way family relationships sometimes remain after a betrayal too large to fully forgive on any predictable timeline. Walter has said only that he hopes eventually there's more there to rebuild than there is right now. The story isn't really that a family dumped their grandfather and karma delivered a tidy consequence 3 weeks later. It's that the systems meant to catch exactly this kind of harm depend entirely on someone paying close enough attention to notice a pattern before it finishes unfolding. Walter didn't lose his home, his fortune, or his independence because fate intervened. He kept them because one nurse, on a quiet hallway shift, refused to treat a missing bank statement as none of her business.